Hello, everyone. This is Matty Dalrymple, and this is one of the patron and podcast guest only events for the followers of the indie author. And I am joined so far by Jennifer Hilt and Kristina Adams. And today we are going to be talking about horror tropes using the movie 10 Cloverfield Lane as an example. And Jennifer is just the person to lead us through this conversation because she's the author of the Trope Thesaurus and the horror trope thesaurus, and I think coming up the romance trope thesaurus, if I remember correctly. So we'll probably have to get together again with a romance book when that's available for people. And we're just going to have an informal conversation. If only podcast guests and patrons are invited to these live events. If you would like to join a live event, you can become a patron by going to patreon.com/the indie author, which is indie with a Y. But obviously, we're putting the recordings of most, but not all of these sessions up afterwards for other people to enjoy. So I'm going to dive right in to our discussion of 10 Cloverfield Lane. And so I'm going to throw the question open first to our trope expert. And you don't even have to talk about it initially with regard to tropes. Jennifer, what did you think of 10 Cloverfield Lane?
Okay. My favorite part was John Goodman. I haven't seen him in anything in a really long time. And so I was really surprised what a great actor he was. And so that was kind of the favorite thing for me, was that sometimes when I see movies with people with faces that are so familiar, it's hard to, like, I always see, whenever I see George Clooney, it's always George Clooney to me. It's hard for me to get absorbed in a role that he's in. But I really felt like that did not happen in this movie, which I loved, because he quickly just became Howard to me. And I was like, okay, is he a good guy? Is he a bad guy? He thinks he's a good guy, but what does he really have at stake? And so I think that was my favorite part of the movie, was just, I loved his unpredictability and the nuances of his character that really, for me, helped push this whole thing along.
Yeah, and just to give a little bit of background, I probably should have done this to begin with, but 10 Cloverfield Lane was, I have to look up to remember what year it came out, but it was described as, this is actually kind of a horrible description, but there are lots of things authors can learn from this movie, and one of them is that I think this description is pretty bad. But after surviving a car accident, Michelle, Mary Elizabeth Winstead, wakes up to find herself in an underground bunker with two men. Howard, John Goodman, tells her that a massive chemical attack has rendered the air unbreathable, and their only hope of survival is to remain inside. Despite the comforts of home, Howard's controlling and menacing nature makes Michelle want to escape. That's like a pretty it's a pretty bad description. Yeah. But it was directed by Dan Trachtenberg, I think is how you say his name. And really, John Goodman, Mary Elizabeth Winstead, and a third character, John Gallagher Jr., were almost the only characters in it. There were actually a couple of other teeny parts, but they were the main ones. And then the genres it's listed in Amazon, and we'll talk about this a lot, I think, are suspense, horror, science fiction, and drama.
Interesting.
So we had picked this. I did intentionally pick this for a conversation about tropes because I watched this first a number of years ago, and I'll just put a general spoiler alert out there. This is going to be chock full of spoilers for 10 Cloverfield Lane. But so we picked it as the example for talking about horror tropes, but intentionally because it takes a bizarre twist at the end. Let's first start out with horror tropes. Do you watch these kinds of movies with like a little checklist next to you where you're looking for the tropes as they come up in various kinds of movies?
No, actually, I don't. They just kind of, for me, it's kind of like a game afterward to like think of all the things. And I like to like watch something first just as a viewer to like get caught up in it. And for some things that are more to me clunky than others, the tropes will pop out. And I really like it if after I watch something, I was like, oh, this had, X trope in it, and I didn't even realize it because it was so well enmeshed in the story. Those are like my favorite kind of movies to watch. But I guess the thing I think that about horror tropes that I wanted to say that I think gets lost, especially like in our popular culture, there's a lot of focus on like slasher, but really to me, the whole horror genre is about relationships. And I feel like that gets lost. You think about romance and you're like, oh, of course it's about relationships, but this is a great example of that because this whole movie is totally the relationships of three people and that like, triangle between them. And it's not necessarily as Matty says, spoiler alert at the end, special effects or blood or stuff like that. There's there's a little of it, but not really as the movie progresses. So it's really the psychological tension in that conflict between the three characters. And I feel like that's a great example of what the horror genre can be at its best, is like using that tension. So that was like, I was super happy when you picked this one, because I was like, oh yeah, you're not distracted by a lot of other things from the storyline.
Yeah, I didn't want to pick one that was too horrible, because I wouldn't want to watch it myself if it was really like a slasher kind of thing. But I think that there's probably another sort of like people in isolation. Would that be considered a trope of horror, or is that like a subset of tropes?
There's definitely like the haunted house that people use, and I think this is definitely like a version of that in a way, because of like being trapped in that house. But I mean, and I think if to drill down low, at the kind of the base level, all those are really just forced proximity. And that's what we like, is when everybody's like together, there's no escape, and like the tension can start generating. So I kind of just tend to think of like, what are the ways that you can increase the pressure for forced proximity? And, this was really the baseline of how they did that.
Yeah, there was a part at the very beginning that I wanted your take on, both of your takes on, because I got confused, even though this was the second time I watched it with a break of several years in between. But at the beginning, there's just a scene, there's no talking. It's a picture of the primary, Michelle, the primary female character, packing up some bags and talking to someone on the phone. You can't hear what she's saying, but it's kind of clear from her expressions that it's, a sad and upsetting conversation. And then she gets in her car and she drives away. And there were implications, I thought, of an earthquake happening. Because there were some scenes of like a thimble on a table, and then the thimble started rolling. And when I first watched it, and I actually had forgotten this, I started the movie the first time thinking it was San Francisco, because I thought I was seeing an earthquake. And then I'd forgotten, when I started watching the second time, I was thinking it was San Francisco. It's actually Louisiana. But did you know what was going on there at the beginning?
I didn't. Well, we can ask Kristina too, but when I watched it again the second time, I was really wanting to see that, for the same reason of like how that matched up with the end. And so this time I noticed, okay, they made a point of showing like that she took her wedding rings off. And then there was a lot of the emphasis on her being a designer, like with the thimble, and there was like the patterns and stuff. So I was curious about that. I didn't see the thimble shake, but that is actually, I'm sorry, I missed that, because that makes me feel better. In terms of like, I felt like there wasn't enough foreshadowing in the beginning of this for how the ending turned out. And I felt,
in my opinion, there was no foreshadowing.
Yeah.
Which we're going to get to in a minute.
Yeah.
I have a huge gripe with how it ended. But that might have just been me misinterpreting some, maybe she was supposed to have like bumped the table, which knocked over the thimble, which was the foreshadowing of the fact that she was a designer, and sewing ends up factoring into it.
Right. The thing I got this time that I hadn't kind of caught before was how it was more of a theme of how she said she always runs away when things get tough. And so then I was like, okay, this time, so like she took her wedding rings off, and then, she mentions that after she meets the other two guys, but then that idea plays into her in the end. But yeah, I was really confused of why we needed the beginning beyond the, in this viewing, taking the rings off. And then I guess if the thimble was shaking, but I didn't really understand why we needed to see that first shot. And we couldn't have just gone to her in a car in a hurry getting out of town.
I think
oh, go ahead.
It's
Kristina.
because it's I hasten to say sequel spin-off of the film Cloverfield, and it ties it. I think it fits the timeline of that, because I haven't seen the first one. I only know what I've read on IMDb and what my boyfriend told me, because he saw it years ago. But I think there's an earthquake in that. So I think it's to establish the timeline from that, but I'm not 100% sure. And from what I've heard, there was a lot of criticism of the fact that, yes, it's set in that universe and it was marketed as like a sequel to the original, but it's a very different kind of horror until that end sequence where you've got the weird alien thing. Yeah. And I knew that was coming, and I still thought this is bonkers and doesn't fit the rest of the film.
Yeah, I think that's a great lesson, potential lessons there for people writing in a series, because I know I haven't seen that previous movie either. And I know there were some Easter eggs throughout 10 Cloverfield Lane for people who were familiar with that world. But yeah, I found it very distracting. And the other thing I thought was bizarre that I don't think that there's exactly a written equivalent of, but so she leaves the city, she's driving along, she's driving, into this wooded area. And then there's an accident that's sort of the precipitating event of the rest of the movie. And for some reason, the other bizarre choice they made was to intersperse the beginning credits in the middle of the accident. But it did seem to me they could have just had the credits like over the phone conversation and then just done the car crash, or they could have cut, like you're saying, Jennifer, they could have just cut that earthquakey part if they weren't trying to make this tenuous connection to the previous movie.
Well, that makes more sense what Kristina was saying, because when I watched it again, I'm like, why do we see this? So.
Yeah, and I think that's something, I mean, we've already alluded to it now, so we can put it out there now. I think, no, never mind. I'm not going to say that. I'm going to hold off talking about the ending until we get through more of it. But I thought that it did a nice job of setting up that kind of a sense of isolation that I think would be part of not the people in the bunker, but the fourth proximity thing, that there's so few characters. There really are just the three characters that end up in the bunker. There's one woman who shows up outside the bunker. There's a character who's described as the driver, who I don't even know who that is. And then there's a special guest voice appearance that we'll talk about in a minute. But just the fact that the world is so claustrophobic even before she gets in the bunker, I thought was very effectively done.
And you don't get a lot of backstory about who she is either. You see the little like hints and stuff, but she doesn't speak until she's in that bunker. And I think that adds a little bit more of a mystery. And you don't know anything about her or the other two people she's trapped with. So you're like, well, can you trust her? Is she relatable? Because she's your way in, but you don't know if she's more or less trustworthy than the others. But you're kind of on edge around all of them.
Yeah, I thought that was very nicely handled. I liked how that was portrayed.
Yeah.
And as we get into the bunker scene, so the storyline is that she wakes up, she's in a car crash, she wakes up, she's in this bunker with John Goodman, and then as it turns out, another person, and John Goodman is telling her that there's been an attack either by like the Russians or aliens, and that she can't leave because, the air outside is poisonous and she would die. So there's like a good chunk of the movie where I, at least not having any expectations about this movie, thinks, okay, either John Goodman is a psycho, or there's been an attack outside. And I thought it was really nicely handled throughout the movie about kind of yanking you from thinking one to thinking the other. What did you guys think about how that was handled?
Oh, I'll just jump in, and then I want to hear what Kristina has to say too. Yes, I really thought that was true too. And for me, like I said, he really like made it, because I would be like believing him, but then I was uneasy. And I guess one of the things I was thinking about with him is there's, the phrase, the villain is the hero of their own world. And I was thinking I thought this was a really great example of it, because in her eyes, he is the villain, but for him, he's like, wants some appreciation, and he feels like they should, be thanking him and all that. So I thought that was interesting. And I just enjoyed how he set up that tension of giving and taking away all the time. And you just didn't know what the cost was going to be. It's a side note, but it was really irritating me, and wondered what you guys thought. She had the least clothing on through the whole movie. Of like, I just was like, oh, that's so interesting. She gets injured and she's got like, a sleeveless top on. The other guy's injured, and so I just kind of like, oh, some things never change. Doesn't matter what the genre is. But I kept mentally trying to like cover her up a little bit to, I don't know, even it out, I guess, with the guys. But
yeah, I can't remember what she was wearing when she left, or if you could even really see what she was wearing when she left the apartment. I'm assuming it was the same thing. And I imagine it was because not only, she's a beautiful woman and moviegoers want to see, as much of a beautiful woman as they can, but also because I felt like it made her more vulnerable. John Goodman sort of, lurking over her, with her in her, little t-shirt kind of thing, felt much more threatening than if she'd been wearing a button-down blouse or something
Yes, yes. And I came to appreciate it more when the stuff about he started mentioning his daughter and about them being like a family. And it was, it did make her seem more kind of kind of childlike in a creepy way to have her dressed like that. So it was just something that kind of kept like popping up in my mind. But
is there a clothing aspect of tropes? Like, are certain kinds of clothing more commonly found in horror than others?
it's a good question. I haven't actually thought about that. I think that depending on the venue of horror, the like kind of subgenre of horror, there definitely are like the scantily clad females. I was thinking of like more like the kind of slasher ones that they make, that there's like 10 or 12 of them, but I don't think is like a blanket statement. Horror has females dressed in I don't know. I got to think about that. It's a good question.
We should be able to ask that woman, since she's like a clothing designer, right?
Yeah, right.
The heroine of the story is a clothing designer.
Yeah.
What are some other tropes, Jennifer, that you saw in this?
Yeah, well, definitely I thought Michelle was very much the tortured heroine, because she just always, seemed like that was her deal. And definitely Scar for this whole thing of like, she had scars of whatever happened to make hers weren't as obvious of knowing what happened to her, but like Howard losing his daughter, and then his whole thing about not making it to his track scholarship, and then his sister disappearing. So I really think that those helped inform like the backstory of the characters and why they had, hurts and things like that too. So I really liked those. What other ones were? I was just trying to think of ones that were specific to like their character identities. What else was I thinking of with them? Oh yes, the thing I thought was interesting about Michelle, and we could talk about this more for the end, is I really thought she was the ugly duckling character, or had that ugly duckling trope going, because she was the only one out of the three of them who really, her character had a real arc, since the other two died. So I thought that was an interesting thing that I've noticed in horror, where there is the use of the ugly duckling to battle the monsters, and that the protagonist character can like come out on the other side of it. So that was like, oh yeah, that makes sense to me. And I thought I liked that, how it was well done, even if like, a little on the improbable side as things went.
I kind of see it as a bit of a metaphor when it's the ugly duckling or the final girl or the weak one or whatever that comes out, and they're the one who defeats the villain, whether they're human monster or monster or ghost or whatever, because everyone wants to be able to think they can overcome these horrific things they've witnessed, they've experienced, but a lot of us carry them around. Studies have shown that watching horror, and in particular playing horror games, can actually work as a form of therapy, helping us to get over trauma, regardless of what that form of trauma was, and allow us to work through it, because we can then overcome it in a safe space and reclaim that agency that we didn't have in that moment of trauma. So that's part of why I actually really like horror as a genre, and I never used to. I didn't get into horror until less than 5 years ago, when I started watching Conjuring films and really connected with that and Hill House and the metaphors or things like grief in Hill House and the Babadook. And that's what made me go, there's so much more depth to this genre than I've ever experienced, because I grew up in the 2000s where it's all slasher films, and I don't want to watch people just stab each other and lots of blood and gore and whatever. And I have seen some of those films and I don't mind them as much as I used to, but I'm still not watching the Saw films, don't mind Halloween, can kind of understand the psychology of that, the statement it's trying to make. But there is so much more to the horror genre than what we think of as horror these days.
Absolutely. That was the biggest kind of lesson I learned with just watching a whole bunch of different kind of films and reading, because I'd always liked the Shirley Jackson kind of psychological horror. And so it was like interesting to just see, okay, there's even more than that in different subgenres.
Yeah, I read Hill House last year after one of my old lecturers recommended it to me. I got to the end and I was like, is that it? But that's it? And then I was like, well, think about it in the context of when it was published compared to now. They published very different things. Their climaxes and books were very different. Whereas now we want something very big and bold. Back then you could get away with being a lot more subtle. And it definitely is.
Yes. And her stuff is great because it's so relationship heavy, Shirley Jackson. And it was at a time that, there weren't a lot of women writers, at least in the US in the early part of the 20th century. And like, she was just doing stuff that was like really upsetting people, because they're like, wait, you're supposed to like write nice stories. And, how dare you?
How dare you
Yeah.
write these horrible things?
Yes.
I
About
really
your own
like-
family often.
I think one of the reasons that I really like this movie is that the creepy part. I like creepy. I don't like horror in the slashery sense, like we're talking about, and more like psychological aspects of it. And with a couple of exceptions, there really isn't any gore in this movie. And one of the things that I think was especially effective, especially harking back to what we were saying before about, like, sometimes you think, wait, is John Goodman telling the truth? Is he not? Is he psycho? Is he crazy? Is he a good guy? Whatever. There were parts, especially like when they were sitting around the table and he would say something that sounded completely plausible and reasonable. And then he would give this, it was sort of like his eyes were unfocusing.
Mhm.
Or he suddenly like his attention drifted off the face of the person he was talking to. And I just thought that was brilliant. It was brilliant acting on John Goodman's part, but I think there's also maybe a lesson to learn there about not necessarily eyes drifting off someone's face, but that just that little tiny bit you could drop in to make the reader go, is this really as I'm thinking it was? That's a lot of what I really liked about John Goodman's performance.
I agree. And I think it's like the subtext. Like I was thinking of the scene where after she tries to make an escape and she whacks him over the head with a bottle and cuts his head. And then he has her sew him up. And it was just like so good because you're not expecting that. She's not expecting yet. And the kind of back, like, so he's going to trust her to do this. What's she going to do? Like I really thought, oh yeah, this is really interesting. There's like a lot of little subtleties. And, and his logic was like, well, you caused it, so you're going to fix it. Even that was kind of like, I don't know if somebody had tried to injure me like that. My first thought would be like, okay, give them again something sharp to fix the injury that they had just caused,
Yeah.
and like, so what that example of his thinking made you go, interesting, like, where is this going to go? And yeah.
He creeped me out so much. Like my main memory of John Goodman is seeing him as the dad in Coyote Ugly. So to see him in this, it was really hard for me to separate that. And then he's just so unnerving and subtle. And I think it's the subtlety that makes him so unnerving, and the calmness. Even when, like you say, she hits him and then he asks her to fix him. And it's just the most bizarre setup.
Yes. And another example of that, probably is my favorite one, is after the demise of poor Emmett, where he brings the ice cream into them.
Yeah.
That was like, I was like, okay, I really like this.
That was when I just kind of thought, yeah, this guy's officially bonkers.
Yeah.
And she needs to get out of there fast. Like, I will take the aliens over a guy like that any day.
Yeah, that's interesting because that's not him acting crazy out of context. It's him acting crazy in context. Like he's doing something that if you were just to clip out his dialogue would seem perfectly reasonable until you realize that he's just dropped a guy into a vat full of acid. Right. And now his very naturalness seems all the more creepy, which I think is a cool lesson that writers can take from that.
Yeah, that subtext, and how he really then seems to, with Emmett gone, he really seems to address her. She really seems to have slotted into that role of the daughter, because he said, oh, Michelle used to like her ice. He doesn't even give her a choice. It's like, this is the way my daughter used to like her ice cream. You're going to have it too, because I know you're going to like, just making all those assumptions. So you're like, yeah, he's definitely left, the realm of any kind of, careful, or I guess, non-psychotic thought.
Yeah, another thing I thought they did well, the screenwriters and John Goodman did well, is that sometimes he'll say things that on the surface seem, again, taken out of context, like they'd be a good guy thing to do. Like when he says, I don't like you talking that way at the table, and Michelle doesn't either, to Emmett. And again, taken out of context, if it would seem like he's being thoughtful of her, but it's super creepy because suddenly he's like co-opting her personality.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's that subtle type of control that he's trying to show, because she's not Megan. And one thing that I found on IMDb when I was reading about it that I'm kind of disappointed they didn't include or allude to a bit more was what happened with Howard and his wife and his daughter. I don't know if I missed that, but it says there was a feature out on the Blu-ray, and it talks about a timeline of the construction of the bunker. And it says they moved to the farmhouse in 92. By 93, he'd started to build it, and his wife and 17-year-old daughter left in 2010. So at this point, he's been away from his daughter for about 5 or 6 years when this happened.
Yeah.
And probably trying to recreate her almost through other people.
Yeah, I think there were a couple of things like that I was reading that they had to cut for time purposes. But I almost feel like I loved reading that in the trivia. I saw that as well, and I thought it was super cool. But I think that I almost enjoyed in the movie better wondering about it. Like, I don't know, maybe there was never a Megan. Maybe there was never a wife. Like maybe his craziness extends even that far.
Yeah, I agree. I didn't read that. I would have, because I'm like always like a sucker for all those little bits of trivia. But I did like that you didn't. There was always that question of is it really true or not? I think Emmett, he was the one who kind of would say fill in stuff about her, but he didn't have a lot of information about the daughter either. So it was kind of like, okay, kind of reliable. I guess there was one, but you really did wonder. And you also wondered, like, well, are they buried somewhere here? It seemed like that.
I definitely thought he'd killed his daughter, to be honest. Until I read the extra stuff, I thought that's what he'd done. But I almost feel like the fact that she left him makes it worse and haunts him more because it's not as final. So I think that just including a little bit more to that in the film would have made us understand him that much more and been able to really go, oh, this is why the guy's completely off his rocker. Oh, okay. Right, because if he'd killed her, you almost would have thought he'd have been off his, well, he was off his rocker before that, he was building the bunker. But it probably pushed him even further, the fact that she made that decision and his wife made that decision rather than he made the decision to end things. Because I think did he kill Brittany? I forgot.
I think the assumption is yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that
was almost like his way of getting revenge on her, or you could see it that way anyway. That's how I saw it.
Yeah, I imagined that Brittany had tried to escape, or he caught her scraping "Help Me" into the glass and killed her by accident. So that like his plan with Brittany, the young woman he kidnapped before he kidnapped Michelle, is to just keep her there forever, right? Like, yeah, if you go too far down the rabbit hole, I think it starts being even more mind-boggling than it was in the movie. And I made a point too. There were a couple of points where plausibility-wise, and okay, we're still excluding the end. Before the end, there were a couple of plausibility things like, can you really make a spacesuit out of a shower curtain? Like, there were a couple of things that I was willing to go, okay, I'm going to go with it. But there were a couple, and now I can't think what they were. See, I guess the movie was so good that I'm forgetting them. But there were a couple of things where I was like, that just went like a little beyond what I'm willing to swallow. Did you guys encounter things like that?
I'm not a very technical person, but I didn't really get how if the air is poisonous, how the whole underground, how that filtration system kind of worked. But I thought, I'm not going to dwell on it because I probably wouldn't have understood the technicalness of it anyway, if they try to do that. But it was kind of one of those things that, yes, with the shower curtain spacesuit, I was like, yeah, I guess I could have used a little more information about how that worked.
And the soda bottle mask.
Yes.
That made no sense. That bit really bugged me.
Yeah.
But the bit that actually annoyed me more was her injuries.
Mm-hmm.
They were so vague, and like she was limping at one point and he was telling her she'd need crutches. Right. But then she was never really showing any signs that she'd been injured, and the kind of accident and how dramatic that would do some serious damage. And she looked relatively fine. She didn't look traumatized by it on top of what he was doing. And I just felt like that was glossed over to get her into the bunker, when actually it would have been even more tense and even more dramatic if she had actually been incapacitated and genuinely struggling to walk for a much longer period of time, because we don't know how long they're actually in the bunker. Or did I miss that?
Well, I think you can only tell by I was tracking the progress of John Goodman's cut on his forehead. and you could kind of guess how long the filmmakers wanted you to think it had been since that event happened, because the cut became more and more healed. So it went from being like quite a severe cut to, at the end, it was almost completely healed. So you've got to believe it's weeks,
Right.
It was kind of the impression.
But she wasn't even struggling at the start.
Yeah.
And she was meant to have some sort of issue with like her knee or something. And I just wasn't buying that she was injured at all. And that's one of my pet peeves, is when they get injuries wrong, because in any film, in any book, in any TV show, it annoys me so badly. Like one thing that actually really winds me up as a writer, I think it's just because like I live in pain a lot, so I know that it's very nuanced. There are different kinds. Sometimes it's sharp, sometimes it's aching, sometimes it's like a searing pain. And when people just go, a character's in pain, like there's nothing for the reader to go on, there's nothing for the actor to go on if that's in a script. So I think that kind of thing, if you're gonna do it right or cut it out. Like, just say, oh, it knocked her out, but now she hasn't got a concussion. Dog, you don't need to go on the podcast as well. You don't. Sorry, I've got Millie on my lap trying to crash. And you don't need to. I've lost my train of thought because of the dog. What was I saying? Yeah, if you're going to cover it well, or cut it, maybe just give her a mild concussion and then she's fine. She doesn't have like the long-term post-concussion syndrome, or like, don't say there's something wrong with her leg and then suddenly she's walking fine in the next scene. And that's kind of what it felt like it was, other than after she tried to stab him with the thingy-majig.
Yeah.
What's it called?
Yeah.
I've actually forgotten the word.
Crutch.
The crutch, yeah.
That one. Thank you, Matty.
I think it was almost the opposite with Emmett, because Emmett inexplicably had his arm in a sling, I think, the entire time. Gotten it, having been injured ostensibly when he tried to break into the compound. So if Emmett had to have his arm in a sling the whole time, and I can't think of any plot reason that he would have been like faking that he still needed the sling. It's kind of the opposite problem. Like, also show people healing if enough time has gone by, as well as suffering any reasonable ongoing consequences.
I'm thinking with Emmett, I'm thinking the reason why they had him wearing the sling for so long was just to be as a visual cue to the viewers that, like, okay, this young guy, he can't just take him, John Goodman. He has this, I'm guessing that was it.
But it's John Goodman. Like,
he's a big guy. Yeah.
He's a big guy. Nobody's just going to, like,
Right.
overwhelm him without some help.
One thing I wish they had, and I love the amnesia trope, and I wished that they had really kind of invested in that more, instead of, remember, like, I don't know how, again, with the time, all of a sudden she realized, oh yeah, he was the one who pushed her car down the road. That wasn't like a thing she had figured out right away. And it would have been kind of interesting if she had maybe more flashbacks, or there were more things that she didn't know, because, like, one thing that I had assumed was, like, there was never any mention of her husband after she took the rings off. And I was like, okay, like, so.
Oh, I think that was just her boyfriend, right? I didn't get the impression it was her husband. And the ring was her engagement ring, I think.
Oh, okay.
Because I think they referred to him as her boyfriend, or she referred to him as as his boyfriend.
Okay. I had thought they were married, but I was like, wow, there's like never any like mention of, other than, him saying, yeah, your family's all dead. And it was like, wow, there's not like really kind of grieving or any, I don't know. I was like, oh, there could have been some other stuff. I wished they'd used the amnesia trope to kind of tweeze out some of those little things about the past too.
Yeah, it seems like the lack of delving into the relationship with her boyfriend was sort of intentional, because you couldn't do it a little bit. Like, if you're going to talk about it at all, you'd probably have to talk about it enough that it would have taken on a little life of its own. Did anyone notice who voiced the boyfriend on the phone calls?
No.
Bradley Cooper.
I only know because I looked it up.
Yeah.
I didn't recognize the voice at the time.
No, I didn't either.
I didn't either. I mean, I wouldn't know. Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I was just looking at, so actually here, I'm sort of cribbed this from probably IMDb, that there was originally more of Ben in the script, with Michelle getting text from him and later eventually heading out to save him. But they decided that they didn't want her efforts to be about a guy. J.J. Abrams said it was reductive and also felt impossible to invest in a character. I think there's something wrong there.
Yeah.
That the audience wouldn't get to know.
Hadn't met. Oh, interesting.
It did kind of lead to him feeling a little bit pointless, though. Like, you could easily cut that scene of her packing up to leave him, or replaced it with like her going on holiday or to visit her parents or something, and you wouldn't really have lost anything, because she didn't really care about him anyway. She was leaving him, and we never found out why she was leaving.
Yeah, it's almost like it was just a setup to have the ending of she's no longer running from the things that frighten her
Mhm.
It's kind of a tenuous setup,
Yeah.
but I'm assuming
Yeah.
they did that because it couldn't be like she had a nice weekend with her parents and then she was heading home and got in the car accident, because you need her to be running from something at the beginning. I don't know. Yeah, I agree. It's kind of a little bit.
I think you're right, and that's probably what they were trying to achieve. But I wonder if her going for a nice trip out with her friends or her family would have actually made us feel her pain a bit more, because she would have been more worried about these people that she was going to meet. And maybe if we'd seen her with a picture with her friends or her family, it would have grounded it. So we would have felt her concern about other people. But there was just this one offhand remark about everyone outside being dead by John Goodman's character. And then the outside world wasn't hugely addressed again, or the worry about the people out there. And like, it doesn't matter how isolated you are, you've got people in the outside world that you're worried about in a situation like that.
Well, I'm going to use that reference to, maybe having had a happier beginning, or, showing her with friends, to talk about the montage in the middle where Howard, Michelle, and Emmett are all having a nice time in the bunker, which I thought was brilliant. Does anybody want to talk about that, either pro or con?
I think it was a good use of the kind of fun and games that they talk about in Save the Cat, of like, what you expect this scenario to, the expected kind of scenes. And I thought it was a good way to do that, to move it along without losing tension and subjecting us to a whole lot of repetitive conversation.
I think it just showed the absurdity of the situation. Like, you almost like they're trying to make the most of it, even though this whole thing is completely insane and they're possibly the last people on Earth. They're really trying to enjoy themselves because they feel like they don't have a choice. So it's almost comedic in a way, but in a really dark sort of way. So it almost adds to the horror then, because they don't have a choice but to have fun, because it's that or die, basically.
Yeah,
which doesn't make it sound as fun in the end.
Right.
Well, and I think it also gives them opportunities in like milliseconds to expand their characters. Like there's the scene where Emmett's doing the jigsaw puzzle and he puts the piece in and then he tries to hammer it into place when it obviously doesn't fit. I just thought that was like, if you're going to spend, I should go back and time that scene. It's probably like, I don't know, a minute and a half or something, right? Maybe not even. And I just thought it was packed a whole lot of plot and character development into a tiny, tiny space. And I also have to say that for people like me who watched Castaway with Tom Hanks and thought that didn't seem so bad, if only there were a dentist on the island, it sort of like plays into your, this is probably not as attractive maybe after COVID, but at the time it came out, that idea of being like, you have no responsibilities, you have no, you're in your safe place, kind of tapped into that. So it was both horrifying, but also you're like, oh yeah, if the world is going to hell in a handbasket, then being in a bunker maybe isn't the worst place to be.
I cannot stand board games. So it was, as soon as they like panned over to that early in the movie of like, oh, we have that, I was remember thinking, oh God, there better be something good in that bookshelf, because the thought of having to do that just it was just personally like made me shiver.
I just thought, what do they do when they run out of books and films? What do they do? Like, they've got the board games, but you're going to get bored of all that entertainment. Like, if you're stuck there indefinitely, no one knows you're there because there's no obvious entrance to it. You're going to get mad. Well, they did go mad, technically.
Yeah, they did go mad.
Yeah.
The other scene that I really liked related to the games is when they're playing, I don't know what the game is, but they, like John Goodman draws the card and says, I see you when you're sleeping. I know everything you do. And it keeps building and building. And Emmett thinks that he knows that he and Michelle are scheming against him. And in fact, he's trying to give a hint for Santa Claus. And I thought that was like, even knowing what he's doing, like, even if you're watching, you think, oh, I think I see where they're going with this. I also got a tickle out of that.
Yeah. Yeah, that was really well done.
So I am going to switch over to my least favorite part of the movie, which is the ending. So spoiler alert, finally, Michelle vanquishes, like Emmett has been dropped into the pool of acid, as has John Goodman. She's blown him up. She's out in the world. It turns out they're birds flying and stuff like that. And then the aliens show up. I couldn't even watch that part the second time through because it pissed me off so much. What did you guys think about the ending? It really was aliens.
I was prepared for it because I knew most of the plot because I was already I talked to my boyfriend about it first. So I don't know if that's cheating, but I kind of knew it was coming, so it didn't surprise me. But like watching it, I just thought it felt really lost. It could have almost done with like a few shadows or something when she looked out, just to hint that something else was coming. Like there was no foreshadowing, and I think that's what it really missed and made it just feel like it was plonked on the end to tie in with the rest of the universe. And it just was, I mean, I didn't, in terms of like it being an action sequence, I didn't hate it, but it was one of those endings that just didn't feel like it belonged in the rest of the film. It felt like a completely different genre.
When she turned around and she saw the spaceship on the horizon, I thought that the first time I saw it, I thought that was the ending. And I thought that is pretty clever because it makes it clear that John Goodman, although a psycho, actually, like he was both a psycho and telling the truth about what was going on. But then there's the whole like, no, the aliens are attacking her in the shed and stuff like that. And I was just, I spent the whole time going, no.
Yeah.
You can't do that. And that to me, that's why I was so interested in talking about this in terms of tropes, because I was like, no, you have to pick, and then you have to provide the tropes that are associated with the right genre and not the other ones. Jennifer, what did you think about that?
No, I thought it was totally tacked on too. And I also was like, oh yeah, we're just going to end it right here, that thing in the distance. And then the rest of it was just like, you know, the saying, begin as you mean to go. And I was like, there was no preparation for this. So it did feel totally tacked on. The other thing that kind of was a salt in the wound on it was when the alien was so cliched, which to me is different than a trope. A trope is like a general idea that you can form, but the mouth alien with the hole and it sucks up the truck, and she gets up this idea to throw the fire, you know, like that's been done before multiple times. And it was like, oh, and of course, you know, she plunks back to Earth, she's still in one piece. And that part was just like, wow, it was just painful, I thought, after watching all the really, you know, tight tension of them being in this enclosed space, to have it, I don't know, just kind of whack you over the head.
Where were her injuries? I want her more injured. It's not realistic. And it's not a superhero film, so it's not like she's got magical powers. She's not Jessica Jones.
But it looks like a superhero because she's wearing the shower curtain with the duct tape, with the silver duct tape. So she has like this like scrapped together superhero outfit.
Yes.
With the weird duck that's been chopped up from the shower curtain.
Right. Well, like Kristina was saying, that it's like attached to another world, I guess was how but I didn't know that. And so I was like, it seemed completely out of left field when I watched it, and, you know, disappointing about the aliens too, just because it's like, I don't know. That part.
I think the problem is, like, for fans who'd seen the original, this is so different from the original, but they sold it to be like the original as well. Yeah. So regardless of what your expectations were for the film, it didn't fit your expectations, because it's not just being trapped in a bunker. But if you've watched the original Cloverfield, it's all handheld cameras like Blair Witch, and it's all about the alien and stuff. So like they couldn't be more different in terms of horror. The only thing that could have made them more different was probably a ghost or something instead of an alien. So, or maybe a slasher. You know, they couldn't have chosen two completely different tropes from the genre. And like I say, I feel like there just needed to be something to tie it more into the other film. I know there's a third one as well, which is set in space. I haven't seen that, and I don't know how that leans in or fits in as well. But apparently J.J. Abrams wants to keep doing films in this universe, so...
Interesting.
Yeah, well, I think it is an interesting lesson for writers, because if you're writing in a series and then you have this idea that's that different, my advice would be write it as standalone, because I think J.J. Abrams has probably gotten to the point where he can do whatever the hell he wants to. Stephen King. Like, don't take writing lessons anymore from Stephen King, because honestly, he can do whatever the hell he wants. But I think, you know, if he got all excited about the idea of having like the Cloverfield world, then I think somebody should have just stopped him and said, no, this is like a great John Goodman psychological suspense thing. Let's not try to make it into Space Invaders.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It was, the end was like, oh.
Yeah, I would totally recommend this movie to people. And many people, let's see, on Amazon, it has 4.4 stars from over 9,000 people. It got nominated for a ton of awards, mainly in like the genre movie kind of thing. But I would say just watch until she looks off in the distance and sees a spaceship, and then stop it.
Yeah. Right. And you could have they could have easily had, because they showed that like the big sky and the bridge and all that in that first scene, you could have even had some kind of shadow. That was what I was, when I watched it again the second time, looking to see if there was something like that, because I thought, okay, then maybe that foreshadowed the end, but there didn't. But I kept like wanting to like give you some heads up, because yeah,
I think there are, according to IMDb, a lot of sort of Easter eggs for people who follow these things. And I think it's yet another interesting question for people who are writing series, that how many things do you drop in that are going to be fun for someone to read who's read previous installments of the series? Mm-hmm. And how do you weigh how confusing those things are going to be to the people who are just picking up that isolated thing?
Right.
You've got to remember your genre at the end of the day and why people read that genre, because the type of people who watch Cloverfield are going to be very different to the type of people who watch 10 Cloverfield Lane, because yes, they're horror, but they're different subgenres of horror, and they're trying to achieve and say different things within that. And like you say, it would have been much better almost as a standalone, because I think it can understand what they're trying to say, and almost the fact that by having John Goodman's character in this world, it's showing that he was crazy, and also that craziness was rooted in some level of there is a threat out there out to get them. But at the same time, it just was missing some pieces to make it fit properly. And again, there's the subgenre thing, because you built those audience expectations up, and then by not fulfilling them, you upset both sides of the audience. You've got to remember what hat you're wearing, and it feels like they tried to wear multiple hats, and it just didn't quite sit right.
Yeah, and you don't know what's more annoying to get through, 95% of a movie you love and be disappointed in the last 5%, or go to a movie that you think you're going to love, watch the first 5 minutes and go, huh? It's like a woman running away from her bad engagement. That's that's not what I had in mind at all. I'm going to go watch, Avengers of the Galaxy or whatever. And not that I don't like those kinds of movies, but if I want that kind of movie, I'm going to watch that kind of movie, not have it stuck on at the end.
I think the good thing about like any sort of Marvel film is they have a plan. Not all of them are great, don't get me wrong, but they have a clear plan and vision for every single film and where it's going and how it leads into the next one, the next one, the next one, the next one. And you can quite often dip in and out. It doesn't really matter if you've not seen all of them at this point. You can get the gist as long as you watch some of the bigger ones. But for this one, it feels like there wasn't really a plan or a clear vision of how to tie these things together. So they just kind of plonked things in, and then didn't feel like it was a part of the bigger picture. It just felt like it was kind of haphazardly sewn in, rather than done with that careful thought and planning that shows how much a creator really cares about their project.
Yeah, definitely could have been like, had a very indie feel with this 3 of them in the bunker until the end, and then it was like, oh, this is a big budget
special
thingy. Yeah.
Well, I think it would be interesting to end the conversation by saying what's something that we think writers, like 2 lessons we think writers should take from 10 Cloverfield Lane. One thing we thought was really well done that we think could be played out in the writing world, and one thing that we thought was not well done. And so I'll start by saying that I thought that those subtleties of John Goodman's performance, where he was almost being completely normal, but there was just one tiny thing that was off that kind of made your skin crawl, like that idea of unfocusing from the person's face, or him doing something that would out of context would seem very normal, like bringing ice cream, which seems super creepy considering he just killed somebody.
I really want ice cream now. We've gone on in and it's too late to buy any.
Maybe if you rewatch that scene, you won't want it anymore.
Yeah.
But that would be that. I would say that would be the thing I think writers can learn as a good thing. I think the whole ending is too obvious, so I'm going to skip that as my cautionary tale. But I think that just watching out for those things that even in the context of the imaginary world you're creating, people are going to kind of go, like, really, she's being protected from the poisonous air by a shower curtain and a soda bottle. I'm willing to suspend disbelief to a certain extent, but watch out for those things that are going a little beyond what you set up with the rest of the world. Because the rest of the world seemed pretty logical. Like, he would describe things that were going on in the bunker, how it was built, how it was organized. I'm like, it seems plausible to me, and once you set up that what seems like a plausible world, then you can't really interject an implausible thing at that level.
Mm-hmm.
So how about you guys?
What he describes is almost the Last of Us game, and the fact that you can't inhale the air in a lot of places because then you will become infected. And they've gone down a different route with the TV show, but like it does feel almost like this film would have been better off set in The Last of Us than in Cloverfield.
It would have been better
Because
off
that is
set
all
in...
about. Go on, what were you saying, Matty?
I misheard one thing you said. You said it would have been better off set in what world?
The Last of Us. It's a game that's recently been turned into a TV show.
Okay.
It's about a fungus, basically, that infects the brain. And one of the ways you can catch it in the game is through inhaling the air. And they've changed it for the TV show to make it more visual. I won't spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it yet. And also just because thinking about it really grosses me out on the TV version. But the way John Goodman described it really did just remind me of The Last of Us game, and that whole fear around you can't breathe the air, you need these gas masks, no one's safe, everyone's dead, blah blah blah. That is The Last of Us, basically.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think any reader or viewer is willing to go with everything as long as it's of a piece. Once you've built your world, then the parts of the world have to comply with that. If you set up a world where, the air is poisonous, then we're willing to go with that. But then you can't say, and people can fly. You have to kind of pick your world and then stick with it.
Yeah. And to try to not jerk the reader out of the world, which I think was kind of the problem with the shower curtain too, as it was like a little too cutesy if it maybe hadn't been quite so, I don't know, it was the graphic and all that was just a little like out of sync with what the rest of that very regular world looked like.
Yeah.
That for me was also kind of irritating. I guess the thing that I think is really good about this that I liked was the tension between the three characters. And I think it's encouraging to us as authors to really feel like, we can dig into those relationships and cause that kind of tension. We don't, yes, you can have various other kinds of plot things, but to not be afraid to create those scenes where there's just a lot of playing off each other. And I thought that was really neat. And I really appreciated that in this movie. And then the thing that like we talked about was just the kind of the lack of consistency in terms of at the beginning and the end. And you feel like you kind of wandered out of the wrong movie when this happened. There was another movie. Oh, I'm trying to remember. Oh, shoot. There was another movie that I had watched that the same thing happened with Meryl Streep and Cage, and she played the writer, the Susan Orlean. Remember where she played about the orchids and the writer? Oh, shoot. Anyway, darn. But it was the same kind of thing. It was like one movie up to like 75%, 80% of the movie. And then the last 10 or 15% was super violent and completely unlike the first part of the movie. And I'm like, oh, the orchid
adaptation.
Yeah, adaptation. Yes. Yes. And that was like, I felt like, wait, is this like, am I somehow watching a different movie? And it was like a same kind of thing in that it was, really kind of jerks you out of what you were, the experience you were having and trying to like get you to have a different one.
Yeah. How about you, Christine? What would you take as the two lessons?
I think for me, the bad would be the fact that it didn't know its genre. And it's important, I think, for us as writers to know what genre we are trying to hit. And if we want to hit more than one, to find ways to juggle them alongside each other. Like Shaun of the Dead is very clearly horror comedy, and that you're prepared for that going in. Whereas this, it could have leaned in maybe more to the comedy angle if it wanted to, like it did in the montage degree, or it could have done more with the aliens to show it was a part of that world. and for the good. And I think this is something I'm consciously aware of, because I know I have very large casts of characters, and it's that you don't need a lot of characters or a very vast expansive world to do something effectively. It's just that you've got to really know those intricacies and work with them and take the time to really explore that nuance, and that's where you can create some real magic.
Very cool.
Yeah, definitely.
So exciting. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up on that note. And I want to thank you guys so much for joining me for this event. And I would encourage you guys and everyone else to keep an eye out for other movies or books we'll be talking about as part of the indie author patron community.
No, thanks for having us. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was. Thank you.
Mhm.